you?
I am well. Nice to be back talking about celebrities.
I know, our favorite part of the day.
This is why we do it. So, as you know, I did not do a lot of research for this today. So, you are taking the reins, which I really appreciate. I know we have a couple of people we want to talk about. Do you want to start with J-Lo and Ben Affleck?
Yeah, let's start with a little update. You know what's so interesting? I was expecting a lot more to come out when we had done our initial podcast, and I've been a little surprised by the lack of information. They've done a good job at keeping things, at least divorce-wise, out of the public eye. There's been like a few little rumors that have been circulating. The first that we were going to touch on is some of the gossip mags have been saying that.
Wait, just quickly before we get to that point, I think it's so interesting, and we didn't talk about this, that you're so right. It's been very quiet since she filed. But remember, before she filed,
so much
it was
speculation.
Everywhere. So much speculation, and now that it's actually filed and everything was right, it's just crickets.
I know.
How interesting.
I'm like, I need more, guys.
What's going on?
So yeah, one of the things that came out was just like this little tidbit in gossip mags that they maybe have been separated a lot longer than was indicated on her petition. Obviously, we had talked in our first podcast at data separation, the significance of data separation, and some of the gossip mag sources have kind of speculated that they actually were separated for some time and in fact did what we kind of alluded that they might be doing, which is being photographed together just for the purpose of keeping public appearance. Right. So obviously no real evidence to support that is what's going on or what had occurred, but there is some speculation that maybe there was some fake pap walks occurring.
And I think it makes sense, you know, it's so interesting to be a celebrity and you're actually seen. You have to kind of think about that persona you're putting on. And, you know, family law kind of treats the date of separation, you know, as if it's something that is, I wouldn't say they think it's easy all the time to figure out the date of separation, but I think there are just, you know, human relationships don't break down, you know, on one day. So I can see there being difficulty in figuring that out. I think date of separation is usually not that big of an issue in most cases. And so maybe it's just easier to choose the date that you filed as your date of separation because that does feel like, you know, a final step you're taking. And that's maybe when you really fully admit that you are, you know, the marriage is done.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's interesting because to your point, marriages don't break down on one day. That's such a good point. And yet we don't see as much speculation or argument about data separation, mainly because what it really impacts, I think, is assets. And if you don't see a big, for
it's
example,
a few months, it's not a big deal.
It's not very significant. And sometimes, in some cases, you know, even a few years, it's not. I mean, it might be, depending on the parties, of course. But usually, you're right, that people can find. I'm going to take that back, that a few years actually is pretty significant.
I was going to say, maybe once we start getting to the years, it might be an issue.
I'm going to take that back because I'm thinking of a very specific case where it wouldn't matter, but I would say as a whole, actually, a few years is going to be a big jump.
I think it also just shows a misunderstanding of the relationship. You know, if I thought me and my husband, you know, our date of separation was 3 months earlier than his, I think that's reasonable, and we still kind of understand what's going on in the relationship, even though there is that difference. If you're 5 years off,
I have a case where we were 7 years off. And it was like, we're really
interesting,
having different stories here, going on different version of events. And a lot of times I think it can be strategic, if you will, right? If you kind of have a story you could attach to your version of the date of separation, you look at your finances and there is a big jump and you're thinking, that's a good day. Separation. So we do see that. But yeah, it's usually not a big issue in cases. I think parties do indicate a day and they kind of agree to it, and it's not not a big issue.
Interesting layer of the date of separation for celebrities is you know, one of the things one of those subjective factors the court looks to is, you know, are you holding yourself out as, you know, husband and wife, wife and wife. When you're a celebrity and you know, shocker, are maybe not always your authentic self even in public, you know, how do you grapple with that? And I doubt this will become a big issue. Like we said, the date of separation is probably only a couple months different, if it's different at all. But, you know, would
the analysis change, right? Because you do look so much at what the parties are objectively doing in their day-to-day lives. And with celebrities, there is kind of this extra layer there, which is like, is it publicity?
Right. Well, and if she's maybe, I know she had a movie coming out this summer, so maybe you don't want to have the whole publicity tour be about your divorce, so you know, hide it, you do the necessary pap. Of course, in my life, no one's watching me, so if I broke up with my boyfriend, I wouldn't have to think about, should I bring him to this event? And
even though from a private perspective, parties do that. You
You're
have
right.
a marriage and you have kids and you're not really ready to go public. Maybe you're attending. We see this actually. I've seen this in cases that I've had. They're not ready to announce to the kids. The parties have had an agreement that they're, for all purposes, separated. But then they're maybe doing family events together and things for purposes of not wanting to communicate that to their friends and family or their children. So there is even that layer privately, but if you're a public figure, it's on such a grand scale that it's more complicated. Yeah. I was going to actually speak to the fact that now there's rumors that it's the opposite, that they had this might be in relation to the movie that did come out, and maybe it was just publicity around to get people to watch the movie.
All good is,
he produced it, I guess, and she's an actor in it.
Okay.
I don't know what the movie is. Okay. I have to admit, I don't know. I just saw she was walking the red carpet, and Matt Damon is also in it, I guess.
Oh, yeah. I do know
and
what you're
talking.
It
just
happened.
Picture where Matt Damon and her are talking.
Yes.
No clue what the movie is. The publicity is not working because I can't tell you the name of the movie.
All news is good news or whatever. All publicity, whatever. If we don't know the name of the movie, maybe
not. But the point of this is to say that they were recently photographed together having brunch with all their kids, and they looked very friendly. Yeah. They were close. I think they might have been, maybe not holding hands, but hands were grazing. And so people are saying, well, are they getting back together, or was this...
Well, that adds another layer. Yeah. We talked about this during our last podcast, I think, how the children have apparently become very close. And so perhaps they're just going to kind of keep things nice and balanced for the kids. But then you see those pictures and...
Yeah. Also adds another layer to day separation. Because it's like, okay, well, is there a reconciliation? And as we know in the state of California, there can only be one date of separation. Right. So if there's been any speculation...
If you get back together, it's a new date of separation.
Yeah. So very interesting. And I wish there was more to report, but actually there's really not. I guess the other thing that I saw, which is also just speculation and rumor, is that Ben Affleck was having a relationship with Kit Kennedy.
I did see that. And that kind of
that hasn't really gotten a lot of traction either. So whoever's doing the PR and putting out the fires is doing a really good job because nothing's really taking off.
It's annoying to me.
Yeah. Maybe people have just decided we're really not all that invested. We're kind of like, okay.
All right. This is the second time we've tried.
Yeah. But it'll be interesting. I am curious if they do get back together. I don't know. I could see that being part of their story, that they get back together. Like maybe she
the greatest love story never told.
Yes, exactly.
The second one is coming.
Yeah, I guess I know. Part two. Which, just to say, she could technically withdraw her petition. Now, if she files, Ben can't say, I'm not going to divorce you. Obviously, it's a non-fault state, but she can withdraw her petition, and they can, in theory, not go forward with the divorce.
I have seen it, so...
Yes, I've had people ask me about it. Yeah.
All right, let's talk about Nikki Garcia, formerly Nikki Bella, and her husband, Artem. Yeah. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. I apologize. He's from Dancing with the Stars. And I know you looked further into this, so why don't you let me know?
So... we have some speculation online. There was an arrest that occurred on August 29th. Artem was arrested for domestic violence. There hasn't been any sources verifying what happened exactly. We don't know the details, so we're not able to speak about it.
And a lot of times those domestic violence filings are, filed under seal. They take some more precautions.
Yes.
But we know that Nikki did end up filing for divorce.
Yes. So Nikki ended up filing. She cited actually as the day of separation, the day the incident or arrest occurred. So one could speculate that maybe there was something that occurred between the two. We don't know.
I think let's discuss it as if we know that she was the victim. It seems like it makes sense, but technically we don't know who his victim was, and domestic violence requires, a certain relationship, but it could be, your child, it could be your mother, it could be someone you're dating. But we'll just...
For purposes of the podcast, just because... But again, it's speculation. We don't know, and there's been nothing to verify, and we probably won't know unless something comes out. But
the reason it's interesting is because when there's a finding of domestic violence and there's a divorce, there are some impacts, which is why we want to talk about it.
So she filed. He just recently filed his response a couple of days ago, September 13th, and they do share a 4-year-old child. And he's asking in his response for joint legal custody, joint physical custody, and also for spousal support. And the reason why we take note of that, if there's any domestic violence being alleged on either side, is what we call the 3044 presumption, which we've spoken about on the podcast. But essentially, the presumption applies to most impactful if there's a child involved is child custody.
Right.
And the presumption essentially states that if one party is found guilty of domestic violence, that they shall not be awarded joint physical or joint legal custody of the child.
Right.
And of course, not sole custody as well.
Right.
So,
and it's a rebuttable presumption.
Right.
So there are things the court looks at and, can still make findings. And I think you and I have found that there are sometimes cases where even when there has been a very clear finding of domestic violence, they almost, the court orders almost 50-50 custody.
Yeah.
There's been some court cases about that. I still feel like...
I don't feel like there's been a bright line rule.
No.
I mean, in cases have said it can't be 50-50. It can't even look like 50-50. But we'll see. I think there's still development in that area of law. But you're right about the rebuttable presumption. Yeah. Typically, you won't see it being the same day, right? If there's a finding in domestic violence, it's hard to say you rebutted the presumption the same day that finding occurred. So there might be some time where custody's impacted, and then you can eventually gradually let me clarify. Perhaps you have done work and you can rebut the presumption at the DV stage, but it's not as common as what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think it's more of a question of, practicality.
Yeah.
Maybe the court or the statute would allow that, but it would be kind of hard because what you're, when you're rebutting this presumption, you are, showing the court why it's still in the children's best interest to have, a significant amount of time with you.
Yeah.
The idea behind the presumption is that by being abusive, that's not in your children's best interest, and that's why we need these changes to custody.
Yeah.
So to rebut that presumption, it almost has to take time to show that there's been a change since you were found guilty of the abuse.
Yeah, to clarify for people who are listening in that there are certain steps you can take to rebut the presumption, if you will, right? So, for example, you can attend anger management classes, parenting classes, individual therapy. So, again, from a practical perspective, those things take time.
Right.
And so it would be hard to rebut the presumption at the finding stage.
Correct.
And that's why it's so rare.
One of the things I think the court really does look to is how long has passed between the incident and the findings. And, when you go in and ask, and if you've gone 3 years without incident, that's really, strong evidence to, rebut that presumption.
Yeah.
You're cooperating with the orders and things like that. So, again, it's time.
Yeah, exactly. So with respect to this case specifically, or these parties, right? So there's this alleged DV kind of overhead of the case, and then they have the dissolution filing, and she's filed, and he's responded, and he's asking for custody. So we always kind of, a red flag goes off if there's DV in the background of how custody is really going to play out and whether or not there can even be an award for joint custody, legal or physical. And then obviously the other thing that he's asking for in his response is spousal support, which is also influenced by the 3484 presumption, which basically states that an abused party cannot be forced to pay the abuser spousal support, right? Which makes sense. So DVs naturally, and I say DVs, domestic violence restraining orders, occurrences of domestic violence are always going to muddy the waters of dissolution. And typically they are going to be litigated at the forefront because of the fact that they do influence so many of the issues in a dissolution matter, such as, like I said, custody and spousal support.
Interestingly, in this case, because as far as we know, he is facing criminal charges, right?
I haven't been able to I'm assuming because he was arrested for domestic violence that there's maybe perhaps something pending, but there's not been any verification that a CPO has been issued a criminal protective order or an emergency protective order. And you're right, I get where you're going. It's a really important point that we should have made at the outset.
So, I think right now they're in criminal courts. They're dealing the criminal system. I don't know if I'm going to make the point you were making, but let's say that he is found guilty criminally of domestic violence, and that domestic violence was against Nikki.
Yeah.
She doesn't have to relitigate that domestic violence incident in family court because the bar is so much higher in criminal court to be found guilty that you can just... I'm about to make it sound simpler than it is. It's never this simple, but you should be able to just, walk into family court and show that he was found guilty by a much higher standard. And get your own finding in family court.
It's interesting. I'm glad you brought this point up because actually David and I were talking about this before, and that was David's question essentially, right? It was, well, if there's a criminal matter and a family matter, like, do you need both? And the answer is you can actually have two existing at the same time. You can have a civil restraining and a criminal restraining order. But you bring up a good point. If you have a criminal protective order in place, you most likely you are going to get the civil restraining order.
A permanent one.
Yeah, permanent one. And then that's up to you as a client whether or not you feel like it's worthy of, or if you want to have both protections in place. And from a practical perspective, maybe you would want to do that if you could have a longer restraining order under under the civil restraining order. Like, for example, I know in the state of California, a lot of times CPOs will be like a period of 1 year, and then there's the potential of it being dismissed thereafter. So in that case, whereas, for example, family law, it can be up to 5 years. So you could always have
it seems like there's an easier renewal process as well.
Yeah, exactly. So perhaps that would be the benefit to having both, but you don't have to.
Right.
And you may not.
I think this is something we were talking about, you know, we know about the presumption when there's a finding of domestic violence, but if you were to get that, you know, finding in criminal court, you wouldn't even necessarily have to, I don't think, ask for a family law restraining order, but you could bring it to the court's attention during a custody hearing and say, he's been found guilty of domestic violence against me. He was found guilty in this criminal court, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I think the court would have to make a finding of domestic violence, even though you're not asking for a family law restraining order.
Yeah, that's a great point that you make. And that I do think you're right that would be sufficient for there to be a finding because of the different burdens, which, as we know,
I don't think we mentioned, right?
Yeah,
I probably should have.
Beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal court.
Preponderance
of evidence. I'm like, let me double check this. Preponderance of evidence in civil court.
Well, I had forgotten criminal one, which is like the most well known. I was like, preponderance of the evidence.
Well, because we always are in this world of preponderance of the evidence, so I was thinking too much. I was like, wait, let me. Anyways, so yes, beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal court, preponderance of the evidence, which means more than 50% chance.
It's a lower standard.
Lower burden of proof. So yeah, I think you bring up a good point that if there was a criminal finding, that would be sufficient for the 34 presumption in family law court.
I think you're right. All right,
so we're going to see what happens. Hopefully, you know, domestic violence restraining orders.
I know we're doing that thing. I was smiling.
Where we're smiling and saying something sad, which is, I think, like
the life of a family law attorney.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, but we'll be watching this closely. We obviously hope she's okay.
Hard,
if she was the victim, and if not, I hope the victim is okay.
Yeah, and just that the family can see a path forward. Obviously, when there's young kids involved, they have a 4-year-old. So I don't know. We'll see. But also, with respect to J-Lo and Ben Affleck, we're waiting for more updates. We wish there was more to report, but we will be continuing to come and give updates as
don't worry about that.
Comes in.
We will do it.